Hey guys, before we start the main video, I wanted to add this in. I did forget in the video to mention to you guys that we are having this Tuesday at 10 at the office. Tracy Niersty from MyBor is going to be here, and it's as you know, MyBor stepped up their enforcement of MyBor rules, things like that, and she's going to just be here to talk about the easiest and best ways for agents to avoid fines, what they can do, maybe explains what's happening a little bit better. Anyway, that's this Tuesday the 2nd, and now on to our featured video. Hey United Indie Agents, recently an issue popped up across my desk here, and it's something I want to explain to you guys so that you know how to avoid this issue yourself or how to prepare your clients for potential risks regarding this issue. Let's just talk about the issue. The issue is earnest money. So, and not submitting the earnest money. So we've probably all had a listing, or maybe we're representing a buyer, it doesn't really matter, but the buyer submits the offer and then for some reason has, buyer's remorse, or for whatever reason they regret making that offer, and they're like, hey, no problem, I had 2 days to submit the earnest money and I'm just not going to submit the earnest money, and then the transaction and the contract will just disappear. And that is not the case. That is never a good thing to advise your buyers to do. And this is the reason. Just because the buyer doesn't submit the earnest money doesn't mean that the contract all of a sudden becomes void, and it doesn't mean that they're never going to have to give that money to the seller. Actually, what it does when the buyer won't or doesn't submit the earnest money, the contract is still in place, the buyer is still in the contract, and all the legal bindings attached to that contract, and now the buyer is in breach of the contract. What that does is that, at that time, the seller can mutual release or actually terminate unilaterally that transaction at the seller's choice. But just by not submitting the earnest money doesn't mean that the buyer has terminated the contract. And we have had an issue here one time, this was years ago, where the buyer did not submit the earnest money because they, whatever it was, buyer's remorse, and they did not end up buying the property because they did not submit the earnest money, but the seller did sue the buyer in small claims court for that earnest money, and the judge did side with the seller because the buyer purposely breached the contract. So I hope I'm making sense there. Don't run under the assumption that if the buyer doesn't submit the earnest money in the time allowed, that all of a sudden the contract doesn't exist anymore. That just means that the buyer is in breach of contract, and we don't ever want to suggest to our clients that they should breach a contract unless they fully have been told all the risks that they're taking. Anyway, if you find yourself in this position and you can't quite remember this video, just always give me a call and I'll be happy to go over it with you just to avoid that pitfall. All right, guys, that's it. Have a great weekend. Bye.